The summer breeze carried laughter and splashing sounds across Silver Lake Park that fateful Sunday afternoon. Children played near the water's edge while parents chatted on checkered blankets, enjoying the warmth of the June sun. Among them sat Mrs. Chen, a retired swimming instructor in her early 60s, who had made it her routine to spend weekends at the park, reading her favorite mystery novels. The peaceful scene shattered and a piercing scream cut through the air. Mrs. Chen's head snapped up from her book, her eyes immediately drawn to the commotion near the lake's deeper end. A small boy had wandered too far from the shore, his tiny arms thrashing against the water's surface. His mother stood frozen on the beach, her horror-struck face matching her terrified screams for help. Without hesitation, Mrs. Chen sprang into action. Decades of muscle memory took over as she sprinted across the sand, her sandals flying off her feet. She didn't think about her age, her arthritis, or the fact that she hadn't been in the water for months. All she saw was a child in danger, and nothing else mattered. The water was colder than she expected as she dove in, her clothes becoming heavy as they soaked through. But Mrs. Chen was no stranger to rescue operations. She had trained countless children and adults during her 30-year career. With powerful strokes, she cut through the water, reaching the struggling child in seconds that felt like eternities. "It's okay, little one. I've got you," she assured the boy, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She positioned herself behind him, supporting his head above water as she had done hundreds of times before in her teaching days. The boy's panic began to subside as she slowly guided them both toward the shore. By now, a crowd had gathered at the water's edge. Someone had called emergency services, and sirens wailed in the distance. But Mrs. Chen remained focused solely on her task, getting the child to safety. Each stroke was deliberate, each breath measured, even as her muscles began to protest against the strain. As they neared the shallow water, the boy's mother waded in, tears streaming down her face. Park rangers arrived just as Mrs. Chen's feet touched the bottom, and they rushed to help them both onto the beach. The child was quickly wrapped in towels and checked by paramedics, while his mother alternated between hugging him and profusely thanking Mrs. Chen. But something wasn't right. As the adrenaline began to fade, Mrs. Chen felt an unfamiliar tightness in her chest. The world started to spin, and the voices around her became distant, as if she were underwater again. She tried to wave off concerned onlookers, to assure them she was fine, but the words wouldn't come. The last thing she remembered was the feeling of sand against her cheek as her legs gave way beneath her. The park rangers immediately sprang into action, their first aid training kicking in as Mrs. Chen lay unconscious. On the beach, the same paramedics who had checked the boy now turned their attention to her, their faces grave as they worked. The crowd that had moments ago been cheering her heroism now watched in stunned silence as she was lifted onto a stretcher and rushed to the waiting ambulance. News of the incident spread quickly through the small community. Local residents who had known Mrs. Chen from her years of teaching swimming lessons gathered at the hospital, waiting for updates. The boy's family paced the waiting room, their relief at their son's safety now mixed with worry for the woman who had saved him. Hours passed, and finally, a doctor emerged with news that would leave the entire community in shock. Mrs. Chen had suffered a major heart attack during the rescue. The physical exertion, combined with an undiagnosed heart condition, had pushed her body to its limits. But even as the doctor explained the severity of her condition, those who knew her best weren't surprised by her actions. That was just who Mrs. Chen was, someone who would risk everything to help others, regardless of the consequences to herself. The boy she saved, though too young to fully understand the magnitude of what had happened, clutched a hand-drawn thank you card, waiting with his parents for a chance to give it to his rescuer. His mother, still processing the events of the day, couldn't help but wonder about the mysterious force that had placed Mrs. Chen at exactly the right place at that crucial moment. As the sun set over the hospital, casting long shadows through the waiting room windows, the community held its collective breath. The story of Mrs. Chen's brave rescue and its aftermath would soon spread beyond their small town, touching hearts and raising questions about the true cost of heroism. But for now, all they could do was wait, hope, and reflect on how one person's selfless act could create ripples that would affect so many lives in ways they never expected. The first day following the incident would prove to be just the beginning of a remarkable journey that would test the strength of not just Mrs. Chen, but the entire community. The real story, the one that would leave everyone truly shocked, was only just beginning to unfold. As dawn broke over County General Hospital the next morning, the waiting room remained filled with concerned community members. The boy's family had finally been convinced to go home and rest, but they left behind a growing collection of cards, flowers, and small gifts for Mrs. Chen. Among those who stayed through the night was Mr. Liu, the owner of the local grocery store where Mrs. Chen shopped every Wednesday, like clockwork, for the past 15 years. The doctors had worked tirelessly through the night, performing emergency procedures to address the damage to Mrs. Chen's heart. When the lead cardiologist finally emerged from the intensive care unit, his expression was a mixture of concern and cautious optimism. Mrs. Chen had survived the critical first 12 hours, but her condition remained serious. The heart attack had been severe, and her age complicated matters further. What happened next would become the talk of the town for years to come. As news of Mrs. Chen's situation spread, something extraordinary began to unfold. The local Chinese community center, where she had volunteered teaching English to new immigrants, organized a fundraising campaign for her medical expenses. But they weren't alone in their efforts. The mother of the boy Mrs. Chen had saved turned out to be a journalist for the regional newspaper. Unable to simply stand by, she wrote a powerful article about the incident. The story quickly caught fire online, reaching far beyond their small town's borders. Within days, messages of support and donations started pouring in from across the country. Meanwhile, in her hospital room, Mrs. Chen began showing signs of improvement, though she remained unconscious. The nurses discovered something remarkable as they cared for her: a small, worn photograph in her wallet. It showed a much younger Mrs. Chen standing beside a swimming pool with a group of children, but what caught their attention was the location. The photograph had been taken at the very same lake where the recent rescue occurred, dated exactly 30 years ago. As Mrs. Chen's only living relative, her nephew arrived from out of state, bringing with him a story that would add another layer to the already remarkable tale. He revealed that his aunt had lost her own child to drowning decades ago, before moving to America. Instead of letting tragedy break her, she had dedicated her life to ensuring no other parent would experience the same loss. The swimming lessons she'd given over the years weren't just a job, they were her mission. The boy she had saved, now recovered from his ordeal, insisted on visiting the hospital every day after school. He would sit in the corner of her room, doing his homework and occasionally telling Mrs. Chen about his day, even though she couldn't respond. His presence seemed to have a positive effect. The nurses noticed that her vital signs would stabilize whenever he was there. 2 weeks after the incident, during one of these visits, something unexpected happened. As the boy was reading aloud from his favorite comic book, Mrs. Chen's fingers twitched. The movement was slight, but it was the first voluntary motion she had shown since the rescue. The boy's excited shout brought nurses running, and within hours, Mrs. Chen opened her eyes for the first time. Her first words, barely a whisper, were to ask if the boy was safe. When assured that he was fine and sitting right there in her room, she managed a weak smile before drifting back to sleep. This time, though, it was a natural, healing sleep rather than the uncertain unconsciousness of the previous weeks. The road to recovery would be long and challenging. The doctors explained that Mrs. Chen would need extensive cardiac rehabilitation and might never regain her previous level of physical activity. But they hadn't counted on the extraordinary support system that had formed around her. Former students from her swimming classes, now adults with children of their own, organized a rotation schedule to help with her rehabilitation. The local physical therapy center offered their services free of charge. Even the town's mayor, whose daughter had learned to swim from Mrs. Chen 15 years ago, got involved, organizing a community-wide effort to modify Mrs. Chen's home to accommodate her new needs. But perhaps the most touching development came from an unexpected source. The boy's father, a carpenter by trade, had spent the past 2 weeks renovating the lakeside area where the incident occurred. With donations from local businesses and help from volunteers, he constructed a new safety barrier and installed emergency equipment. A small plaque was mounted nearby, commemorating Mrs. Chen's brave act and serving as a reminder of both the dangers and the guardians of the water. As Mrs. Chen began her slow journey to recovery, she was stunned to learn of the impact her actions had had on the community. The newspaper article had sparked a nationwide conversation about everyday heroes and the importance of water safety. Swimming schools across the country reported increased enrollment in their classes, particularly among adults wanting to learn rescue techniques. The story could have ended there, with a heroic rescue, a medical crisis, and a community coming together to support one of their own. But life had one more surprise in store, one that would prove that sometimes the most meaningful connections are formed in life's most challenging moments. As Mrs. Chen grew stronger each day, none of them could have predicted how their lives would continue to intertwine, or how this incident would lead to a discovery that would leave them all questioning whether some things in life were more than mere coincidence. As autumn leaves began to paint the town in shades of gold and crimson, Mrs. Chen's recovery progressed steadily. Her daily physical therapy sessions had become a community event of sorts, with different neighbors taking turns accompanying her to the rehabilitation center. But it was during one of these sessions that a remarkable discovery was made, one that would reshape the narrative of her heroic rescue in ways nobody could have imagined. The boy's mother, while researching for a follow-up article about water safety, had begun digging through old newspaper archives. Her investigation led her to a yellowed clipping from 30 years ago, featuring a story that made her hands tremble as she read it. On a summer day very similar to the one when Mrs. Chen had saved her son, another drowning incident had occurred at Silver Lake. The victim then had been a young boy, and the rescuer, the boy's father. The parallel might have seemed merely coincidental, except for one stunning detail. The father who had performed that long-ago rescue was none other than the boy's maternal grandfather. The article included a photograph of the rescue scene, and there, barely visible in the background, was a much younger Mrs. Chen, watching from the shore with her own small child. When confronted with this discovery, Mrs. Chen's reaction was unexpected. Instead of surprise, a look of quiet recognition crossed her face. She revealed that she had recognized the boy's grandfather the moment she saw his daughter, the boy's mother, at the lake that day. It was why she had chosen that particular spot to read, keeping a watchful eye on his grandson without ever revealing the connection. The revelation sent ripples through both families. The boy's grandfather, now living in a retirement community in Florida, was contacted immediately. His voice cracked with emotion as he recalled that day 30 years ago, and the twist of fate that had brought their families together again. He booked the next available flight home, determined to thank the woman who had saved his grandson. Meanwhile, Mrs. Chen's rehabilitation took an unexpected turn. The boy, inspired by her swimming background, had begun asking her to teach him proper swimming techniques. Though she couldn't enter the water herself yet, she started giving him poolside instructions during her therapy sessions at the rehabilitation center's pool. The center's staff noticed that working with the boy seemed to accelerate her own recovery. She pushed herself harder, moved with more determination, and smiled more often. The local community college, hearing about these impromptu lessons, approached Mrs. Chen with an unusual proposal. They wanted to document her teaching methods and create a water safety program based on her decades of experience. Despite her limited mobility, she agreed to share her knowledge, and soon found herself recording video lessons from her wheelchair at the pool's edge. But it was the arrival of the boy's grandfather that brought the story full circle. The day he walked into Mrs. Chen's hospital room was charged with emotion. He carried with him a scrapbook, and as they sat together, he shared something he had never told anyone. After his own rescue of the drowning child 30 years ago, he had spent years providing free swimming lessons to underprivileged children in the community. As they talked, more connections emerged. The swimming program he had started had inspired others, creating a ripple effect of water safety awareness that had spread throughout the region. Mrs. Chen's own swimming instruction methods, they discovered, had been partially based on the training manual he had written all those years ago. The boy, listening to their conversation, made a connection of his own. The comic book he had been reading to Mrs. Chen during her recovery was about a superhero who saved people from drowning, a character his grandfather had created based on his own experience, which had been published in a local paper's weekend supplement decades ago. The physical therapy center became the hub of their newly intertwined lives. The boy's grandfather began volunteering there, working alongside Mrs. Chen to develop a comprehensive water safety program that combined their years of experience. Their story, now featured in national media, sparked a movement to create similar programs across the country. Mrs. Chen's nephew, watching all of this unfold, shared another piece of the puzzle. The photograph found in his aunt's wallet, the one taken at Silver Lake 30 years ago, had been taken on the very day she had decided to become a swimming instructor. Seeing someone save a child from drowning had given her a purpose, a way to channel her grief over her own loss into something positive. As winter approached, Mrs. Chen's doctors were amazed by her progress. Though she would never return to the physical capabilities of her younger years, she had far exceeded their initial recovery projections. The support of her expanded family, for that's what they had become, had given her something that medicine alone couldn't provide, a reason to push forward, to continue making a difference in people's lives. The boy's mother completed her article series, but it had evolved into something much more than a simple story about a rescue. It had become a testament to how a single act of courage could echo through generations, creating connections and inspiring others to act with the same selfless bravery. One crisp morning, as Mrs. Chen sat watching the sunrise from her hospital room window, she reflected on how life had come full circle. The tragedy that had driven her from her homeland had led her to this place, this moment, where she could finally see that her years of dedication had created a legacy greater than she had ever imagined. But even she couldn't have predicted what would happen next, as a new chapter in their intertwined stories was about to begin, one that would prove that sometimes the greatest miracles come not in the form of dramatic rescues, but in the quiet moments of healing and connection that follow. Winter descended on the town, blanketing Silver Lake in crystals of ice, but inside the rehabilitation center, something remarkable was taking shape. Mrs. Chen, now able to walk with minimal assistance, had begun working with a team of healthcare professionals and swimming experts to develop an innovative water safety program. Her hospital room had transformed into an unofficial office, its walls covered with notes, diagrams, and letters from people touched by her story. The boy, now a regular fixture at these planning sessions, had started bringing his school friends to meet Mrs. Chen. What began as curious visits soon evolved into informal water safety workshops, with children gathering around her wheelchair as she shared stories and safety tips. The hospital staff, rather than discourage these gatherings, recognized their therapeutic value, not just for Mrs. Chen, but for the children as well. One snowy afternoon, as Mrs. Chen was reviewing some training materials, an unexpected visitor arrived. A woman in her mid-30s stood hesitantly at the door, clutching a newspaper clipping. Through tears, she explained that she had recognized Mrs. Chen from the recent media coverage. 25 years ago, she had been one of Mrs. Chen's first swimming students. Now a marine biologist, she credited those early lessons with setting her life's course. This reunion sparked an idea in the boy's mother's investigative mind. She began tracking down Mrs. Chen's former students, uncovering a network of lives touched by her teaching. The stories that emerged were extraordinary: a Coast Guard officer who'd saved dozens of lives, an environmental scientist studying ocean conservation, a Paralympic swimmer who'd found confidence in Mrs. Chen's pool, all tracing their paths back to her gentle guidance. The boy's grandfather, watching this web of connections grow, proposed something unprecedented. Using his business connections and the publicity from his daughter's articles, he started organizing a conference on community water safety. The goal wasn't just to discuss prevention techniques, but to explore how swimming education could transform lives, just as it had transformed theirs. Mrs. Chen's nephew, inspired by the project, took a leave of absence from his tech job to help coordinate. His aunt's story had made him realize that some things were more important than corporate success. He began developing a digital platform to connect swimming instructors with communities in need, using his aunt's methodology as the foundation. As preparations for the conference progressed, Mrs. Chen received news that would change everything. Her doctors, amazed by her recovery, cleared her to begin gentle water exercises. The rehabilitation center's pool, usually closed in winter, was specially opened for her first session. The moment was captured on video by the boy, who had insisted on documenting every step of her recovery for what he called his superhero documentary. The footage of Mrs. Chen returning to the water went viral, touching hearts across the globe. But it was what happened next that truly captured people's imagination. As she floated, supported by her physical therapist, tears streaming down her face, she began to sing, a lullaby in her native language, the same one she used to sing to her own child. The boy's mother, recording the moment, recognized it as the same melody her father used to hum while teaching her to swim. This small connection led to another revelation. The boy's grandfather, upon hearing the song, shared that he had learned it from his mother, who had grown up in the same province as Mrs. Chen. Through this simple melody, they discovered their family's paths had crossed generations before, in a village thousands of miles away and decades in the past. The conference, originally planned as a regional event, exploded into an international gathering. Swimming instructors, safety experts, and community leaders from around the world registered to attend. But what touched Mrs. Chen most were the messages from parents whose children had faced their own water-related traumas, asking for guidance in helping their little ones overcome their fears. In response, Mrs. Chen began recording short video messages from her rehabilitation sessions, sharing not just swimming tips but wisdom about overcoming fear and finding strength in vulnerability. The boy, now proudly serving as her unofficial technology assistant, helped her set up a channel to share these messages, which quickly gained a devoted following. As spring approached, the rehabilitation center's pool became a symbol of something greater than recovery. It became a place of healing for others as well. Children with water-related anxieties would visit, sitting with Mrs. Chen as she shared stories of courage and resilience. Parents found comfort in her gentle wisdom, and fellow seniors were inspired by her determination to keep making a difference. The boy's mother's article series had evolved into a book project, documenting not just the dramatic rescue but the extraordinary ripple effects that followed. Through her research, she discovered that the impact of Mrs. Chen's decades of teaching had extended far beyond their small town. Former students had gone on to open their own swimming schools, each carrying forward her philosophy of empowerment through water safety. One morning, as Mrs. Chen watched the sun rise over the partially thawed lake from her new apartment, a ground-floor unit the community had helped secure for her, she received a letter that would set in motion the next phase of their journey. It was from an international humanitarian organization, requesting her help in developing water safety programs for coastal communities in developing countries. The prospect of her story and methods helping children halfway across the world left Mrs. Chen speechless. But as she sat there, holding the letter, the boy burst in with his usual enthusiasm, already planning how they could use technology to share her teachings globally. His grandfather, arriving moments later for their daily planning session, added his own international business expertise to the discussion. As they talked, Mrs. Chen realized that what had started as a single act of courage had grown into something far greater than herself. The ripple effect of that summer day continued to expand, touching lives in ways she never could have imagined. But even as they began planning this new international initiative, none of them could have predicted the extraordinary turn of events that was about to unfold, one that would prove that sometimes the greatest impact comes not from the grand gestures, but from the quiet moments of connection that bind us all together. Spring brought new life to Silver Lake, and with it came an unexpected opportunity that would transform Mrs. Chen's simple swimming lessons into something far more meaningful. The humanitarian organization's letter had sparked a flurry of activity in their small town, but no one could have predicted how their next adventure would unfold. One morning, as Mrs. Chen was reviewing training materials in her apartment, she received a video call that left her in tears. A small coastal village in Southeast Asia had implemented her water safety program, adapting it to their local needs. The village chief, speaking through a translator, showed footage of children learning to swim in the calm morning waters, using the same gentle techniques she had developed over her decades of teaching. The boy, now spending his after-school hours helping with Mrs. Chen's digital outreach, was particularly moved by the sight of children his age halfway across the world practicing the same safety techniques he had learned. Using his school's geography lessons as inspiration, he began creating a map marking every location where Mrs. Chen's methods were being taught. Each pin represented a life potentially saved, a family spared from tragedy. The boy's grandfather, drawing on his years of international business experience, helped establish connections with swimming instructors worldwide. But it was during one of these video conferences that something extraordinary happened. A swimming instructor from a small coastal town in Mrs. Chen's home province appeared on screen. As they exchanged pleasantries in their native dialect, both women froze in recognition. The instructor was the daughter of Mrs. Chen's childhood friend, the same friend who had comforted her after the loss of her own child decades ago. This connection sparked a new initiative. The boy's mother, still working on her book, began documenting how traditional swimming techniques from different cultures could be incorporated into modern safety programs. She discovered that many coastal communities had their own time-tested methods of teaching water safety, passed down through generations. Mrs. Chen's program began evolving to embrace these diverse approaches, creating a truly global methodology. Meanwhile, the rehabilitation center had become a hub of international communication. Physical therapy sessions were now regularly interrupted by video calls from around the world, with Mrs. Chen offering guidance to instructors facing unique challenges in their communities. The boy, having appointed himself her technical assistant, managed these calls with surprising professionalism, proud to be part of something so much bigger than their small town. But it was during one of these routine video sessions that an unexpected revelation emerged. A swimming instructor from a remote island nation shared a local legend about a traveler who had taught their ancestors to swim generations ago. As she described the techniques this mysterious figure had passed down, Mrs. Chen recognized elements of her own teaching method, the same ones she had learned from her mother, who had learned them from her grandmother. This discovery led to a deeper investigation into the history of swimming instruction across cultures. The boy's mother, with help from international researchers, began uncovering evidence of ancient swimming techniques that had been independently developed in different parts of the world, yet shared remarkable similarities. Mrs. Chen's method, it seemed, had unconsciously tapped into this universal wisdom. The boy's grandfather, inspired by these findings, organized a virtual summit bringing together traditional swimming instructors from coastal communities worldwide. As they shared their stories and methods, a beautiful tapestry of human resilience and adaptation emerged. Mrs. Chen sat in wonder as she watched elderly instructors from different continents describe techniques nearly identical to ones she had developed through her own experience. The impact of this cultural exchange soon became evident in unexpected ways. A group of marine biologists noticed that communities using Mrs. Chen's integrated approach to water safety also showed greater awareness of marine conservation. Children who learned to swim with her methods developed not just safety skills, but a deeper connection to their aquatic environment. Back at Silver Lake, the effects of this global connection rippled through the community. Local children, inspired by video calls with their peers around the world, began organizing their own water safety awareness campaigns. The boy, leading these efforts, showed wisdom beyond his years as he explained to his classmates how their small actions could have global impact. Mrs. Chen's nephew, seeing the potential for even greater reach, developed a mobile app that could translate water safety instructions into multiple languages. The app included features that allowed instructors to adapt the program for different environments, from ocean shores to river banks to local pools. What started as a simple teaching tool soon became a global platform for sharing water safety knowledge. 1 year after her near-tragic rescue, Mrs. Chen stood at the edge of Silver Lake, watching a new generation of swimmers practice their skills. The lake had been transformed with safety features, including a specially designed teaching area for children. But more importantly, it had become a symbol of how a single act of courage could spark a worldwide movement. The boy's mother, putting the finishing touches on her book, had uncovered one final surprise. The traditional swimming techniques Mrs. Chen had learned as a child, and later taught to countless others, had historically been passed down primarily by women in coastal communities. These unsung heroes had, for generations, been the guardians of their community's safety and connection to the water. As summer approached once again, Mrs. Chen received news that would take their story in yet another unexpected direction. The United Nations had taken notice of their program's success and was interested in implementing it as part of a global water safety initiative. But even as plans for this new chapter began taking shape, Mrs. Chen remained focused on the simple truth that had guided her all along: every life saved created ripples that could transform countless others. The boy, now confidently teaching basic water safety to younger children under Mrs. Chen's watchful eye, embodied this truth. His near tragedy had become a catalyst for positive change, touching lives far beyond the shores of Silver Lake. But as they all would soon discover, the most profound changes often come when we least expect them, and the greatest adventures begin just when we think we know where the story is heading. The United Nations conference room buzzed with anticipation as Mrs. Chen's story played on the large screen. Representatives from countries worldwide watched in rapt attention as footage showed the evolution of her water safety program from a local initiative to a global movement. But what happened next would surprise even the most seasoned diplomats in the room. A delegate from a small Pacific island nation rose to speak. With tears in her eyes, she revealed that her own daughter had been saved by a swimming instructor who had learned Mrs. Chen's methods through the recently developed mobile app. The instructor had adapted the techniques for their local tidal conditions, creating a hybrid approach that proved remarkably effective in their coastal community. The boy, who had insisted on accompanying Mrs. Chen to New York for this presentation, sat beside her wheelchair, beaming with pride. Now a year older and noticeably more confident, he had prepared his own speech about the importance of youth involvement in water safety. His simple yet powerful words about how nearly drowning had transformed his life touched hearts across the assembly hall. Back in their small town, the community watched the UN proceedings via live stream at the rehabilitation center. The boy's mother, who had finally completed her book, was there too, but her attention was drawn to something extraordinary happening in the audience. Former students of Mrs. Chen from across the country had made the journey to show their support, creating an impromptu reunion that spanned decades of teaching. During a break in the proceedings, Mrs. Chen's nephew made an announcement that would take their initiative in an unexpected direction. Major technology companies, impressed by the success of the water safety app, had offered to fund the development of virtual reality swimming instruction programs. These would allow children in landlocked areas to familiarize themselves with water safety concepts before ever stepping into a pool. The boy's grandfather, listening to these developments, shared a personal revelation that brought many to tears. He explained how his own rescue experience 30 years ago had led him to develop a secret fear of water, one he had hidden while teaching others to swim. It was watching his grandson's journey with Mrs. Chen that had finally helped him face and overcome this fear. As summer approached, the UN initiative began taking shape in ways no one had anticipated. Instead of simply implementing a standardized program, they were creating a network of local water safety hubs, each adapting Mrs. Chen's methods to their unique environmental and cultural contexts. The boy's mother's research into traditional swimming techniques proved invaluable in this process, helping bridge modern safety standards with time-tested local practices. The Rehabilitation Center, which had played such a crucial role in Mrs. Chen's recovery, was designated as the first official training hub. Swimming instructors from around the world began arriving for intensive workshops, each returning home with not just technical knowledge, but a deeper understanding of the human connections that made the program so effective. One morning, as Mrs. Chen supervised a training session, she received news that left her speechless. A remote village in her home province had credited her program with saving an entire school group during a flash flood. The children, who had recently completed a modified version of her water safety course, had remained calm and helped each other reach safety using the techniques they had learned. The boy, now teaching basic water safety to younger children under proper supervision, took this news particularly hard. The incident brought back memories of his own near drowning, but instead of triggering fear, it strengthened his resolve to help others. He began working with his school to incorporate water safety awareness into their regular curriculum. Mrs. Chen's nephew, seeing the potential for further impact, developed a new feature for the app that allowed users to report and map dangerous water areas in their communities. This citizen science approach to water safety quickly gained traction, with people worldwide contributing local knowledge that could help prevent future accidents. The boy's mother's book, now published in multiple languages, had become more than just a story about a heroic rescue. It had evolved into a manual for community-based water safety initiatives, filled with real-world examples of how small actions could create lasting change. Each chapter ended with practical tips for implementing similar programs in different contexts. As autumn approached, Mrs. Chen received an invitation that would add yet another dimension to their growing initiative. A prestigious medical research center wanted to study the therapeutic benefits of her gentle teaching methods for people recovering from water-related trauma. The Rehabilitation Center, which had witnessed these benefits firsthand through Mrs. Chen's recovery, eagerly partnered in this research. The boy's grandfather, inspired by this development, began organizing workshops specifically for elderly swimming instructors. These sessions focused on adapting teaching techniques for different age groups and physical abilities, ensuring that water safety education remained accessible to everyone. The success of these workshops led to a new branch of the program focused on active aging through aquatic activities. 1 year after their UN presentation, Mrs. Chen sat by Silver Lake, watching a new generation of instructors practice her methods. The lake, once a site of near tragedy, had become a symbol of hope and transformation. But even as she reflected on how far they had come, she knew their journey was far from over. The next phase of their story would prove that the most powerful changes often come not from grand initiatives or global programs, but from the quiet moments of connection between people who share a common purpose. As Mrs. Chen watched the sun set over the lake, she couldn't have known that the greatest challenge, and the most remarkable transformation, still lay ahead. The Medical Research Center's study of Mrs. Chen's therapeutic methods revealed something extraordinary that would change the landscape of trauma recovery forever. As researchers documented the effects of her gentle water safety techniques on people with aquatic fears, they discovered that the benefits extended far beyond swimming skills. Participants showed significant improvements in overall anxiety levels, social connections, and emotional resilience. The boy, now part of the research program as a peer mentor, had found his true calling. Working with younger children who feared the water, he shared his own story of transformation with a wisdom that belied his years. His mother watched in amazement as her once timid son guided others through their fears with the same patience and understanding that Mrs. Chen had shown him. One particularly touching case involved a young girl who hadn't spoken since nearly drowning in a river accident. During her first session in the Rehabilitation Center's pool, she remained silent, clinging to the edge. But as she watched the boy demonstrate Mrs. Chen's breathing techniques, something shifted. By the third session, she was humming quietly to herself, the same lullaby Mrs. Chen used to sing during her own recovery. The breakthrough caught the attention of child psychologists worldwide. They began studying how the combination of peer support and gentle water exposure could help children process trauma. Mrs. Chen's nephew integrated these findings into the app, adding features specifically designed to support emotional well-being alongside physical safety skills. Meanwhile, the boy's grandfather made a discovery that would add another layer to their expanding program. While organizing documents for the elderly swimming instruction workshops, he found old records showing that water-based community gatherings had traditionally served as healing spaces in many cultures. This insight led to the development of community healing pools, safe spaces where people could come together to support each other's recovery journeys. Mrs. Chen, though proud of these developments, found herself facing an unexpected personal challenge. As the program grew, she struggled with the attention and recognition, preferring to work quietly with individual students rather than speak at large conferences. It was the boy who helped her find balance, suggesting they record their pool sessions to share with others while maintaining the intimate, personal approach that made their methods so effective. The Rehabilitation Center, now a hub for both physical and emotional recovery, began hosting monthly healing circles where people could share their water-related stories. During one such gathering, a marine biologist shared how her work with ocean conservation had helped her process her own near-drowning experience. This led to a new branch of the program focusing on environmental connection as a path to healing. As word of these successes spread, the Medical Research Center proposed something unprecedented, a longitudinal study tracking the long-term effects of water-based trauma recovery. The boy's mother, whose book had already been updated to include chapters on therapeutic applications, began documenting these new developments with the help of mental health professionals. One autumn morning, as Mrs. Chen supervised a therapy session, she witnessed a moment that brought everything full circle. The young girl who hadn't spoken was now helping another child practice floating, singing the lullaby that had become their program's unofficial anthem. The sight brought tears to Mrs. Chen's eyes as she remembered her own child and how personal tragedy had led to this remarkable journey of healing. The boy's grandfather, inspired by the growing therapeutic aspects of their work, organized a conference bringing together traditional healers and modern mental health professionals. The exchange of knowledge led to innovative approaches combining ancient wisdom with contemporary understanding of trauma recovery. Mrs. Chen's methods, they discovered, had intuitively bridged these two worlds. As winter approached, the Rehabilitation Center received news that would take their program in yet another direction. A major children's hospital wanted to integrate their water therapy techniques into their rehabilitation programs. The prospect of helping young patients recover from various traumas through gentle water exposure opened new possibilities for healing. The boy, now preparing to enter middle school, had begun writing his own book about his experiences. His simple, yet profound insights into overcoming fear resonated with readers of all ages. "Water taught me that being brave doesn't mean not being scared," he wrote. "It means finding the courage to move forward anyway." Mrs. Chen's nephew, seeing the impact of personal stories in the healing process, added a new feature to the app allowing users to safely share their recovery journeys. These testimonials, carefully moderated and supported with professional resources, created a global community of healing and hope. The research findings continued to surprise everyone involved. Participants in the program showed improvements not just in water confidence, but in overall life resilience. The gentle progression of Mrs. Chen's methods, combined with the supportive community environment, seemed to provide a template for facing other life challenges. As the year drew to a close, Mrs. Chen reflected on how far they had come from that summer day by the lake. What began as a simple act of courage had evolved into a worldwide movement of healing and transformation. But even as she watched the program expand in ways she never imagined, she remained focused on the individual moments of breakthrough she witnessed every day. The next phase of their journey would prove that the most profound healing often comes not from the grand research findings or global recognition, but from the quiet moments of connection between people supporting each other through their fears. As Mrs. Chen prepared for bed that night, she couldn't have known that the most remarkable chapter of their story was about to unfold, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the healing power of water and human connection. 2 years after the near-tragic incident at Silver Lake, the community gathered for what would become a historic moment. The rehabilitation center's pool area had been transformed into an elegant event space, with screens showing live feeds from similar gatherings around the world. But what made this day truly special wasn't just the global recognition their program had received, it was the announcement Mrs. Chen was about to make. Standing at the podium without her wheelchair for the first time since her recovery, Mrs. Chen looked out at the faces before her. The boy, now in middle school, sat in the front row beside his mother and grandfather. Behind them were dozens of people whose lives had been touched by their program: trauma survivors, swimming instructors, medical researchers, and families from across the country. With steady voice, Mrs. Chen revealed their most ambitious initiative yet, the establishment of the Global Water Healing Institute. This wouldn't be just another swimming facility, it would be a living laboratory where therapeutic techniques, traditional wisdom, and modern research could come together to help people heal from water-related trauma. The boy's grandfather had donated land near Silver Lake for the main campus, while satellite centers would open in coastal communities worldwide. But the real surprise came when Mrs. Chen called the boy to the podium. Over the past 2 years, he had been quietly working on something extraordinary. Using his experiences helping other children overcome their fears, he had developed a peer support program specifically for young trauma survivors. His simple yet profound approach had caught the attention of child psychologists worldwide. The boy's mother, who had been documenting these developments for her second book, shared something unexpected. The journal she had kept during her son's recovery had become a manual for parents helping their children through trauma. Combined with Mrs. Chen's methods and the research findings, it formed the foundation for a comprehensive family healing program. As if fate was adding its own touch to the day, the young girl who had found her voice again through their program stood up to sing. The lullaby that had become their unofficial anthem filled the room, but this time she had written new verses, words of hope and healing that brought tears to every eye in the room. Mrs. Chen's nephew captured the moment on the app's new live-sharing feature, allowing their global community to join in the emotion. The Medical Research Center's final report, released that same day, confirmed what they had all witnessed firsthand. The combination of gentle water exposure, community support, and peer mentoring had shown remarkable success rates in trauma recovery. But more surprisingly, participants reported improvements in areas of their lives far beyond water confidence, from better relationships to increased resilience in facing other challenges. Mrs. Chen's own journey had come full circle in ways she never expected. The tragedy that had driven her from her homeland decades ago had led to the creation of something that was now helping others transform their own traumas into sources of strength. As she shared her story one more time, she revealed something she had never told anyone. The night before the rescue, she had dreamed of her lost child telling her to watch over the lake. The boy's grandfather, moved by this revelation, shared his own secret. The comic book character he had created years ago wasn't just inspired by his rescue experience, it was based on stories his grandmother had told him about a legendary figure in their village who helped people overcome their fears through connection with water. The parallels to Mrs. Chen's work were uncanny, suggesting some deeper wisdom that transcended time and culture. As the event continued, news arrived from around the world. Communities that had adopted their program reported not just fewer drowning incidents, but stronger social bonds and increased environmental awareness. The healing ripples had extended far beyond individual recovery, creating positive changes throughout entire communities. The rehabilitation center's pool, where so much healing had taken place, was dedicated as a historic landmark. But more importantly, it would serve as a training facility for the next generation of healing practitioners. The boy, already planning his future role in the program, had started mentoring younger children who showed an interest in becoming peer support guides. Mrs. Chen's nephew unveiled the final version of their app, now enhanced with artificial intelligence to provide personalized support while maintaining the human connection that made their program unique. The platform had evolved into a global network of hope, connecting people across continents in their journey toward healing. As the sun set over Silver Lake, casting golden light through the windows, Mrs. Chen shared her vision for the future. The Global Water Healing Institute would be more than a treatment center. It would be a place where science and spirituality, tradition and innovation, personal healing and community strength could all flow together like streams joining a mighty river. The boy, standing beside her as she concluded her speech, added his own words of wisdom. "Water taught me that healing isn't just about getting better," he said. "It's about helping others find their strength too." His simple truth captured the essence of everything they had learned on their remarkable journey. As the gathering drew to a close, participants from around the world joined in singing the healing lullaby, their voices rising in a powerful chorus of hope and renewal. Mrs. Chen looked out at the faces before her, the lives touched, the fears overcome, the connections forged, and knew that while their story had reached a milestone, it was far from over. For in the end, their journey had shown that the most powerful healing comes not from any single method or program, but from the courage to reach out and help others, even in our own moments of vulnerability. As Mrs. Chen often said, we are all like water, capable of both reflecting light and providing depth, of flowing around obstacles and reshaping our path, of joining together to create something greater than ourselves. And so, as the stars began to appear over Silver Lake, their story became part of a larger narrative, one of human resilience, compassion, and the endless possibilities that arise when we choose to transform our deepest wounds into sources of healing for others. The ripples of that summer day would continue to spread, touching lives in ways that even Mrs. Chen could never have imagined, proving that sometimes the most powerful changes begin with a single act of courage, and the willingness to let that courage flow outward to touch the lives of others.